Good morning and welcome everybody to our AmCham Talks. I'm happy to see you all again. It's the first time in this year. At the beginning, please note that this event will be recorded and published on our homepage as well as on our social media channels. Since last AmCham Talks, new members joined us and I would like to introduce them with great pleasure. Yosemite Clean Energy. This bioenergy development company was founded in 2016 by Californian farmers and an Austrian partner. Specializes in transforming farm and forest wood waste into carbon-negative green hydrogen and renewable natural gas. They are developing a network of biofuel plants that are locally owned by the agricultural and forest communities. Yosemite employs technology developed with the Technical University of Vienna to convert biomass into syngas. So that's really great. And please welcome Michael Saratnik.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this short speech.
Happy to have you as a new member at the AmCham.
Very happy. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes, and the second new member that joined us since last AmCham Talks is First Class Media GmbH. Maybe you know it under the title Circle Diplomatique magazine. First Class Media GmbH is owned by Andrea Föhnweger and Magister Alexander Burski and is the publisher of the magazine Circle Diplomatique. Reporting on hot topics in politics, diplomacy, business, and culture as an important and independent voice since 1971. Published in 2 languages since its takeover by Föhnweger and Burski, and this is, I think, a key factor of its success. Circle Diplomatique is published 4 times a year and a must-read for ambassadors in Austria, as well as anyone interested in diplomacy, international organizations, and global economy. So please welcome Magister Alexander Burski. We're happy to have you as a new member in our platform. So just let me highlight our next events. On February 25th, the next AmCham Talk with Universitätsprofessor Dr. Michael Wagner. I think we all know him from interviews. Microbiologist. March 17th, our ambassador welcome dinner in honor of Her Excellency Victoria Kennedy. And March 24th, a BDO lecture with Magister Katja Reichel. So now it's time for today's topic. The topic is Austria's performance in the Corona-Crisis, health, economy, and data. And I warmly welcome Professor Dr. Tobias Thomas. I just want to introduce him. He's the Director General of Statistics Austria since June 2020, adjunct professor of economics at the Düsseldorf Institute of Competition Economics at Heinrich Heine University, as well as CMDS Fellow at the Central European University. Member of the Standing Field Committee for Economic Systems and Institutional Economics of the German Economic Association, Vice President of the Austrian Statistical Society, as well as scientific expert at the Austrian Pension Commission. Studied economics at the Friedrich Wilhelms University in Bonn and the Technical University in Berlin before earning his doctorate summa cum laude at Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg. So I warmly welcome Professor Dr. Tobias Thomas, and I hand over to you. The stage is yours. Afterwards, we will have a Q&A session. So please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for this warm welcome. I'm very much honored to give a speech today here at AmCham Talks. Actually, when you mentioned all my positions, I have to recognize that I'm getting older and older. It's a clear indication for it. And yeah, perhaps I would like to add that I left Germany. You can hear perhaps that I'm from Germany in 2012, first living in Brussels, then in Zurich, and since 6 years approximately. I have the pleasure to be here in Vienna, and since about 1.5 years to serve here as Director General of Statistics Austria, so the Federal Statistical Institute of Austria. Today, I would like to talk to you about Austria's performance throughout the Corona crisis and the dimensions mentioned. And actually, I think that most of the things I will present to you, you know already, at least in parts. But I think on one hand, the overview will show a little bit the bigger picture, and I will come to some conclusions, especially when it comes to data. And now I will share my presentation. Is it visible now? Yes, wonderful. Okay. Yeah, perfect. So let's focus first on the health situation. Actually, you know all figures because they are daily reported in the media. But actually, we are currently in the Omicron wave, actually the 5th big wave, and this exceeds the previous ones by far. We can see here in March 2020, the very small first wave, then the second wave in autumn 2020, then the third one around April 21, the fourth in last autumn, and now the Omicron wave, which did exceed the previous ones by far. The numbers here are according to the 7-day incidence in Austria. What is the difference to previous waves, actually, that despite the fact that the incidence is on such a high level, the hospitalization and the occupation of critical care beds are rather low. We see here in this figure, this violet line, these are the hospitalization numbers, and we see the blue line below, these are the occupation of critical care beds. Actually, despite the fact that the numbers of hospitalization are growing currently, they are both still on a rather low level, and this despite the fact that the incident rate is rather high. The Corona crisis is a serious one, I have to say, because you can see it in the mortality of the people as well. What you can see here in this picture are the weekly death numbers throughout several years. The red line are the weekly death numbers in the year 2021, sorry. The yellow line of the year 20, and the gray lines behind are the 19 years before, actually. And you can see here really how in the year 2020, the mortality did rise, especially in the autumn time, peaking in the week, in the 49th week of the year, with more than 2,500 people dying in this week, not only because of Corona, but in parts because of Corona. And that was the highest value of death since 42 years. Then after the lockdown measures, the mortality numbers did decline. And if you see on the red line, the number of dead people in the current year, we have a rather equivalent development first. And with the last autumn, the number of dead people per week did rise as well. But however, we never reached the level of the previous year, also of the year 2020. So mortality stayed lower, and this despite the fact that the infection rates are and were much higher in 21. So there's a clear difference in mortality in comparison 21 to 2020. One of the backgrounds of these different developments are the vaccination rates among the population. We see here in this figure the 7-day incident for people in the age of 18 to 59 years, and according to several antibody status, more or less. And I don't want to talk about all numbers, but you see the upper line, so the solid red line shows the 7-day incidence of people who have no good antibody status because they were neither recovered nor vaccinated. And among these group of the population, the incidence, 7-day incidence, is much higher than among the other groups. For instance, the blue line very much below. These are people with a sufficient antibody status to have enough protection against corona. So the incidence is depending on the vaccination status, actually. And when we see, when we have a look at the vaccination rates in Austria in comparison to other countries in Europe as well as the US, we can see here in the stacked bars, the lower parts are people who are completely vaccinated, and these small shaded stack bar parts above are the ones who have at least one vaccination stitch by now. And you can see that Austria is here with about 75% with at least one vaccination, about in the middle field of Europe and about on the level of the US. There are differences between US and Austria according to the question who has 1 or 2 vaccinations already, or even 3, but in the sum the numbers are rather comparable, actually. So there's space for improvement. We will now focus. We are now facing in Austria from the 1st of February, of course, vaccination obligation. That's the one thing. The other thing is that we at Statistics Austria had the possibility to analyze in which population groups the vaccination rates are rather high. And we did find out that really employment and education are drivers of the vaccination rates. Please focus on the left-hand side of the figure here. You see here the vaccination rates among several age groups, starting with the age group of 25 to 29, ending with 60 to 64. And the solid blue line, these are the vaccination rates in these age groups among the employed people. And the dashed gray line are the people in the same age groups which are not employed, actually. And you can see that over all age groups, the vaccination rates among the employed people are much higher than the ones among the not employed. And having a focus on the right-hand side, you can see the same picture more or less. And now it's not the employment status, but it's the highest degree received, coming from above. The highest, the upper solid blue line are the people with a university degree, and the lowest light dashed line, these are the ones who have a compulsory school degree, actually. And you can see here really among all age groups, the higher the education level is, the higher the vaccination rate is. And despite the fact that we will have an obligation here in Austria from the 1st of February, I think that here it's a little bit hinting on the situation that a focused campaign, vaccination campaign, can perhaps bring positive outcomes as well. Let's have a look how Austria did perform in economics terms throughout the corona crisis. First of all, I have to say that the economic impact of the corona crisis did cause the most massive GDP drop since World War II. And we did see and measured this drop in the second quarter of 2020, when the GDP did decline by 13.5%. To compare with previous crises, you can see that this drop in GDP was much more intensive than in the worst quarter of the financial crisis in the year 2009. That was the second quarter of 2009 when the GDP did drop by 5.9%. And when you're focusing on the annual growth rates in the year 2020, we had a drop in GDP by 6.7%, and this is much higher than the drop in GDP in the year 2009, where the GDP went down by 3.8%. However, in the last quarters, especially starting with the second quarter of 21, we did see a strong turnaround, actually, with huge growth rates by 13% and huge positive growth rates in the following quarter as well. Currently, we have the measures for the third quarter of last year. We are working on the fourth quarter. Of course, this is in parts a technical reaction on the very high drop in the second quarter of 2020, but not only, what I can show you in the next picture. We have here on the next picture the GDP development in a longer perspective, actually. And what you can see here in the current numbers, the drop because of the Corona crisis and measures to deal with it. But you can see that we are rather on a high level. And how high the level is, we are measuring with the Austrian Recovery Barometer that compares a certain quarter, for instance, in this case, the third quarter of 2021, compared with the same quarter before the crisis. That was the third quarter of 2019. And as you can see, in the third quarter of 21, the Austrian economy reached already 101.1% of the pre-crisis level. So we exceeded the pre-crisis level already in the third quarter of the last year. Interestingly, this recovery did reach most of the economic sectors. Coming from the right-hand side, the finance and insurance industry with 107.4% of the pre-crisis level, trade, manufacturing, real estate, housing, and so on. Many of the economic sectors are above the pre-crisis level according to the third quarter of the year 21, so last year. But however, not all sectors, for instance, of course, food services, accommodation, so hotels and restaurants are still rather low below the pre-crisis level, here focusing on the third quarter of 21. So tourism plays, of course, a very intensive and massive role in Austria. This you can see in this figure here. We have here the share of food services and accommodation according to the GDP. So how big is the share which is produced in food services and accommodation? And we did take the average of the 5 pre-crisis years, 2015 to 2019. You can see that here in Austria, this share of the GDP is rather high, with 5.2% of the GDP, which is produced in hotels and restaurants and so on. And this is much higher than in the EU average, where this share is 3.6%, and as in the US, where it is 3.1%. This shows how massive actually the weight of this economic sector is in Austria, and so that the measures which were affecting the restaurants and hotels have a high impact on the overall GDP in Austria as well. What can we see from the numbers? Taking some minutes here for tourism. Here you can see the nights spent in Austrian hotels. And as you can see, the development did know in the last years only one direction up till the year 2019, where the number of night spans did peak with 153 million night spans by domestic and international guests, and then you see this heavy decrease, this drop because of so many restrictions in the year 2020 and even worse in the year 21. So compared to the year 2019, the tourism measured by night spans nearly halved in the year 2021. You can see that at the Austrian Recovery Barometer that in the year 21, 52% of the nights spent were realized in Austrian hotels in comparison to the year 2019. This is less serious, but serious as well, of course, among domestic guests, and more serious with only 44% about among international guests, what is straightforward from my perspective. Even worse, the situation, of course, when we come to US tourists. In the year 2019, we had 2 million nights spent by US tourists in Austria, and in the last year, only 400,000. So 4 out of 5 US tourists are still missing. And this is a pity. I hope it will change very soon. But there are positive stories as well to tell, having a look at the industry. What we can see here are the growth rates, monthly growth rates of the production in Austria, the complete production you can see within the blue bars, and the production has 2 parts. One is industry, you can see in the red parts, and one is construction of buildings, etc., which you can see in the gray parts. And of course, you can see this drop of GDP in the year 2020, according to the drop of the drop in the production, according to the drop in the GDP as well in the year 2020. But you can see these massive positive growth rates more or less throughout the whole year 21 when it comes to industry, when it comes to construction and so on. And just on the first glance, you can see that these positive growth rates in the bigger picture in 21 are in a sum exceeding, of course, the drop in 2020. And so it's a question, how is the production at the moment in Austria? And one has to say that industry and construction, and with this production in total, have left the crisis far behind. Actually, when you compare December 21 to December 2019, before the crisis, the total production turnover index was on a level of 144.7% over pre-crisis level. And so these sectors do see the crisis only very far away already. And of course, this is a positive news in economic terms. We are here at the American Chamber of Commerce in Austria, of course, and foreign trade is of special importance for Austria as a small and open economy. And you can see here in the figures, these are the monthly growth rates for imports and exports in Austria. And you can see here in particular in April and May 2020, the drop in both measures heavily, but you can see in the year 2021 that there was a big recovery in imports and exports as well. And this was a driver of the overall recovery of the Austrian economy as well. Going a little bit more in details, what are the top export partners of Austria? We have here on the left-hand side the numbers for the years 2015 to 19 accumulated, and on the right-hand side the numbers for the year 2020 actually. And you can see that the US is, of course, Austria's most important export partner outside the EU. And when we ask what are the goods which are exported to the US from Austria, then it comes to vehicle parts, to metal goods, to machinery, to name the first 3 most important, and many others as well, for instance, medical and pharmaceutical goods. The US is as well among the top import partners of Austria, not so on the very high rank, but on a very remarkable rank. Still, this is again the case when focusing on the years 2015 to 19 as well as on the year 2020. And here it is especially medical and pharmaceutical goods, but other parts as well, which are here the goods which are high demanded in Austria coming from the US. The whole Corona crisis did show its face, of course, on the labor market as well, but not that much intensive. We see here the blue line, the solid line. These are the number of people employed in the year 2019 to 2021. And we can see here some negative development, of course, throughout the crisis as well, in particular in March, April, May 2020, or then in the beginning of the year 21. But the situation could have been worse if the government would not have installed a measure to keep people in employment with the short-time work. Actually, the employment situation would have been the red dashed line if this instrument would not exist, actually. Currently, we are, and with respect to the month 12, the December of last year in comparison to December of 2019, already slightly over the pre-corona level with 101.2%. This is mirrored more or less in the unemployment rate. In December 21, the unemployment rate was measured with 8.1%, and this is a little bit lower than it was in December 2019. These are still too high numbers from my perspective, but actually the crisis is not does not have such a high impact on labor market anymore. On the labor market, there's another problem showing up because we measured at Statistics Austria in the third quarter the highest level of job vacancies actually we ever measured. We are measuring these numbers since 2009. Asking companies which positions they have to fill, and this number is more accurate than the AMS, the labor market service number, because here we are catching more open positions, which in comparison to those reported to the AMS, and we did see the highest number of job vacancies in the third quarter in comparison to all quarters before we measured, and this is hinting on a growing skilled workers shortage. So I think this will be one of the challenges in the next years, of course. This has to do in parts with the demographic change because Austria is getting older and older, and as I don't think that policy has a high motivation to change something in the pension entry age, then the relative share of people in the working age will shrinken, and this is potentially increasing the problems and challenges coming from skilled workers shortage. But of course, there are more challenges, and they are connected to the Corona crisis as well. On this picture, you can see the public finance situation. The red bars are the tax revenues. The gray bars are the public expenditures. And you can see here the black solid line. This is the public debt rate in comparison of the GDP. And we see here really that in the year 2015 to 2019, Austria was on a rather well consolidation path. In this years, the debt rate did shrink from nearly 85% to a little bit more than 70%. And with this, the development went a little bit in the direction of the Maastricht criterion of 60%. But however, because of the Corona crisis, the tax revenues did drop, of course, and the expenditures, for instance, for the short-time work and other subsidies did increase heavily. And with this, only in 1 year, the complete consolidation path did turn around to the opposite, and the debt rate from 2019 to 2020 did rise by about 13 percentage points. And of course, this development was continuing in the first 3 quarters in 21, and we are working on the measure for the fourth quarter of 21 at the moment. So this will be in the midterm another challenge of the current and the upcoming governments. From my perspective, another topic which is a hot topic at the moment are, of course, the inflation rates. Here, the numbers for Austria. Actually, in the last decades, we had a trend of lower and lower inflation rates. In the 70s, the average inflation rate was in Austria 6.1%, and in the 80s, 3.8%, and then they became lower and lower. Currently, in the last year, the inflation rate we measured with 2.8%, and this is, of course, clearly above the ECB target of 2%. What was driving actually the inflation rate in the last year? There were 2 main drivers. The one was the field dwellings, water, energy, but inside this field, it was this time not the rents, it was the household, the home energy, which did rise by 7.7% in the last year. And the second most intensive driver was traffic, actually, and transportation. But the most driver inside this group was the rising fuel prices in the last year with plus 17.3%. Without the increase of prices in the fields of home energy and fuel, the inflation rate 21 would have been 1.8% and not 2.8%. And perhaps we can discuss a little bit other potential reasons for the high inflation rate in the discussion. Actually, of course, the development in the US is from the bigger picture perhaps comparable. However, the inflation rate in last year was massively more higher with 4.7%, as you know, and the Fed did announce already a change in monetary policy, as you know, as well. This will affect, of course, many things, stock markets and so on. Last point I want to make, it comes a little bit to the data situation in the Corona crisis, because from my perspective, there are here many things to learn to perform even better in the future. The first thing is that in the Corona crisis, we had somehow a paradox situation. We had on one hand a huge awareness for scientists. I think Wagner, who will give his talk here in the next on the next meeting, or Nikki Popper and others were very, very frequent guests at the Zeit im Bild and in other news and so on, and they were very present. In addition, I had the feeling that even policymakers had the big desire to really do measures in an evidence-based way, at least in the beginning of the crisis. And experts, scientific experts, were heard actually in the Chancellery and other ministries. However, on the other hand, many scientists and others did criticize that there is a lack of accessible and linkable data. So the data situation is not sufficient. And I did see, and others, lots of inconsistent statistics from different producers, even from different public entities. And this is here just an example. On April 20th of last year, on the same day, the Ministry of Health published a number of corona recovered persons with 560,000. And on the same day, the Austrian Agency for Health and Food Safety, which is under the supervision of the Ministry of Health, did publish 541. So the difference of 19,000 is a little bit high from my perspective. And these and other examples did show that there's space for improvement in the data situation. This space for improvement was mentioned by the Austrian Accounting Council as well, who did write a report on the data situation throughout the corona crisis. And they did criticize that many ministries and public entities and others published on their dashboard in different formats, different times, different evaluation days, different levels of details, very different statistics, even on the same variable and so on. And this did cause somehow a situation with lots of numbers, but lower information level, actually. Experts of official statistics did summarize it like this, that many corona statistics by many institutions did not meet the standards of official statistics. And actually, I think this is a mess because it's not only valid for the field of health data, for many other public data as well, because I think with with a better data situation, we could really would have a basis to manage crisis better and to increase resilience. And the potential to do it better is given from my perspective, because we are now in the fourth or fifth decade of the digital revolution. And with this digital revolution, the volume of data worldwide is growing. You see here some numbers for the year 2010 to 2025, and perhaps the real development will exceed these numbers as well. And this super growth in zettabyte in the global volume of data. And this data could be used under some preconditions, which I will mention a little bit later. In the same way, this digital revolution is causing that more and more data owner and data producers show up, private data owner and producers like companies from the internet world, but from classical industries as well, and so on and so on. And of course, they are using data, collecting data, producing data, and using the data for better basis for their decisions and measures. And on the other hand, there are more and more public data owner and producers. Here just some examples, of course, Statistics Austria, but the ministries as well, the labor market service, the Agency for Food Safety and Health, and so on, and other measures. And in total, this is increasing not only the data volume, but the complexity of the data landscape as well. And the problem is now, from my perspective, that this increase in data does not mean a one-to-one increase in information. We have an exponential data growth, but by no means an exponential information growth. Perhaps information is growing linear or perhaps digressive, we will see. The reason is that I think for informational use of data, some preconditions are necessary. First of all, I think that we need more quality standards, especially when it comes to data by public entities. A very important aspect is that we need better metadata standards, so description of data, so one can really say what the data are about. Of course, we have to take care about data protection and data security. The worries of the population are there. You can read them in the media each second day. And of course, one has not to ignore them. Important to use data is that they are linkable from a legal perspective. The legal basis has to be there, from a technical as well. And last but not least, of course, data science and statistics competences are the precondition for such an informative use. So I think in the next years, one of the outcomes of the Corona crisis, but not only, should be that we should think in Austria about to renew the data governance, actually. The European Union gave itself a European data strategy. Now more and more acts are derived from this European data strategy, like for instance, the Data Governance Act, which was recently discussed on the European level, or the Data Act coming in the next 12 months from my perspective. And I think all the questions of standards, data standards and metadata standards, especially when it comes to public entities, these should be rethought actually, and perhaps legal texts in parts adopted. Other countries like UK did it in a national data strategy, and I think Austria needs a national data strategy as well. When being clear what are the standards and so on, then a data steward on a national level could help to set them through. In Switzerland, the National Statistical Authority is helping to install these metadata standards for at least public entities. Yeah, these standards actually are for statistical authorities already present. They're in line with the United Nations standards and of course in line with the European statistical system when it comes to the code of practice and the quality assurance framework. And of course, we would be ready to serve Austria to improve the data situation, in particular when it comes to public data in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your highly interesting keynotes, Professor Thomas. And I would like to open the Q&A session. Whoever has questions, please unmute yourself and don't hesitate. And
can I ask a question?
of course.
Okay, my question is, has the training provided by the COVID crisis to the Austrian public health system been good enough to challenge any possible upcoming pandemics?
I think lessons have to be learned. There are, of course, some successful stories within the crisis. For instance, the public entities did learn how one could coordinate such a process to set up measures with respect to the crisis. They made positive and negative experiences, and I think the learning process was started. However, when it comes to the data situation, the outcome and lessons learned are still open if they will be set through. I think the problematic is clearly on the table. Yes, many public entities publishing data or producing data, publishing statistics on the basis of very different and sometimes unclear standards. Some are not linkable and so on. And it seems to be that in the field of data, at least some entities are still thinking, we want to keep them under our control, actually. And this is not always a very, very useful thing. At Statistics Austria, at least we will install in the first year now an Austrian microdata center, which will go live by 1st of July. And this legally allows us to provide microdata to research entities, actually more basic research or fundamental research entities in academia. So the access to data will be potentially solved or improved for research entities, but the situation for the administration itself is still an open question from my perspective.
I think Christian Metz, you posted a question on the chat. Maybe you're still here. Yes, whoever.
Yes, there were two things that came to my mind when hi, Christian Metz, AT&T Global Business Solutions in Austria. Two questions popped up in my mind when I saw the slides, which were, by the way, excellent. Thank you very much. It's always good in such a situation to finally spend half an hour on real facts rather than seeing some news every day that might be twisted a little bit. One was this recovery of the construction industry. How much of that was triggered by public spending in reality, or public overspending during that period? Is that, can you extract that part? Or?
Yeah, I could, but I don't have the number here actually. Also, I think that a big share of this are really investments by private investors. But of course, as perhaps you are mentioning, that in addition, public investments could lead to overheating in the thing. I will figure out this question, but I don't have the number as well. But private investments in construction, in housings, and so on, in real estate, are since some years on a high. That has to do, at least in parts, with the monetary policy of the ECB on one hand, but on the other hand, it is the case that Austria is growing. We had, at the moment, we have 9 million citizens living in Austria, and this number will increase to 10 million by 2080, according to our population prognosis. And even in the last years, there was a continuous increase in population. I don't have the number of the share of private and public investment now, but perhaps I can deliver you the answer after this meeting.
Thank you. Second one was more of a fun one, I have to say, but I noticed that beverage exports to the US are ranking extremely high on the export sectors from Austria to the US. Is it possible to extract which percentage of that is just Red Bull?
Also the companies who are delivering data to us, they should be have the confidence that we are not publishing individual data on their businesses. But from a private perspective, not talking as Director General of Statistics Austria, I think Red Bull flies rather high.
That's what I assumed. Thank you.
Alex Schochoff had a question, for instance.
The slides, from my perspective, I see we did forward to you the slides of today in PDF format, and these can be shared from my perspective. If wanted, this is not a problem. And there's another question.
Yeah, maybe this is Andrea Köppel. Just one comment to your slides. As Christian also already mentioned, I found it extremely helpful to get a bit of real data, and it shows that there is good hope to be successful in the future as well. But what comes to my mind is the inflation rate and energy, gas and oil. It might increase due to Ukraine crisis. I don't know. Do you have a bit more of your prognosis? Yeah. How it will evolve and impact not only Austria, it's maybe also linked to the European Union, I would say, and also to US. So
of course. Also here I'm speaking as Professor of Economics and not as Director General of Statistics Austria. From my perspective, we have here a mixture of short-term and more long-term structural effects when it comes to the inflation rate. On the short-term side, I see two aspects which are currently driving the inflation rate. The one is shown with the energy prices and the oil prices in particular. particular, because at least a part of the strong increase in 21 in this field was driven by a basis effect. As you can remember, the oil price on the world market was remarkably low in 2020. The lowest point was $27 per barrel Brent, actually, and that was an untypical low number. In the course of the later year 2020, and then in year 21, the oil price did rise above the pre-crisis level, but inflation rate is always measured from one year to the other. So when it comes to the oil prices or the fuel prices, you measured a very high 21 value with a very low 20 value, and so this partly this effect will not be there in the future because we are already out of the price valley of the year 2020. But this does not mean that the oil prices and the energy prices are not rising anymore, but the comparison point is not anymore an untypical low thing, and this basic effect will be gone up from March 22 actually. So this is more or less a short-term effect. The second short-term effect is, of course, the Corona crisis. Many value chains are still irritated. Not all markets are in the equilibrium. We have on the demand and on the supply side still some shocked situation. We say it in the terms of economists. And I think first Corona crisis have to be overcome, at least the threatening parts. And then I think many markets will come back to an equilibrium, and so these short-term driver will be gone, hopefully in the nearer future as well. However, let's come to the more structural points, and of course I cannot see in the crystal ball, but on one hand, of course, the climate policy initiated in Austria and other countries will lead to an increase in prices. It's wanted, yeah, it's wanted. Prices which are connected to carbon emissions, these economic activities will be more costly. And you can see how the price of the certificates on the EU ETS market are rising since years. And you can see this in Switzerland, carbon emission fee was installed in the year 2008, I think in a price of about 15 or 12 Swiss francs, and now it's on the level of 120. So you can see this direction goes up, and it's wanted, and this will have an effect on the inflation rate. And of course, the turnover or the state income by these fees and taxes will at least be in part refunded to the population. How it is, this is how it is in Switzerland. Two-thirds are refunded to companies and to the households, and we have here the climate bonus are upcoming in Austria as well. However, this is a long-term effect. The second is that, of course, we have a very a low interest rate and monetary policy by ECB since years, and the amount of money is growing and growing, and monetary theorists say this causes inflation for sure. We did see in the last years that at least it is not affecting inflation rate in a direct way, yes, because we had already a very, what can you say, loose ECB monetary policy, and it did not affect the inflation rate in a direct way. However, one has to state that this low tax policy and the growth of the amount of money in the Eurozone is at least remarkable. Another point is that in many countries worldwide, which were previously known as low wages countries, yes, the wages are really growing heavily, actually. So goods which were produced in such countries and then imported for relatively low prices will be not so cheap anymore, and this will be an effect on the prices. Let's see if then other countries will be higher in the ranking of outsourced production. And perhaps the last point is, which I mentioned a little bit in my lecture as well, is that we have here a demographic change. As the population will grow from today to 9 million to 10 million in the year 2080. And this population growth will only take place in the age group 65 plus. So despite the fact that the amount of people who are in the working age will be constant, the relative proportion of this will shrinken, and this will increase the skilled workers shortage, and this can give pressure on the wages actually. So I think in this mixture, the long term is not so clear, but there are some structural points to be recognized. However, oil price will not have the massive impact anymore in the future, and I hope that Corona crisis will be over, at least in the midterm.
Jean-Pierre, you want to ask a question? Jean-Pierre Kalinian?
Yes. No, I just wanted to add, I mean, I think it's clear that data collection, the validity and reliability is spot on with that. The next question is, even if the data is really good and solid, people want to then assign causality as to why things are happening, or prediction actually is even probably more important these days. So yeah, and then you have to ask who, at what time, when, with what intention. Can you create I mean, you see it in politics all the time. Companies may even do it to position themselves as well too. And now we're kind of getting into this, this gray ethical area, and I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and I could have talked about 2 hours about the only last part of my presentation, of course, and then I made there some points which I framed as data science competencies and statistical econometric competencies, because I think, to come to an evidence-based decision-making, or the basis for evidence-based decision-making, the production of data is only the beginning, yes. This has to do, can be improved with methods, with standards, in particular with metadata standards. Often it's simply unclear how the data were produced, what are they about, and so on. And the first thing I think is very better standards for metadata. And when you did collect the data and so on, then of course we are first in the field of descriptive statistics, but this does not say nothing, actually, or at least a part, yes. If you have 2 lines which are developing in the same direction, what does it mean? Yeah, the one can affect the other can affect the one, or both are affected by a third variable, which is called omitted variable bias. The other is called reverse causality. And in econometrics, I'm professor in economics, we are working a long time, decades and decades actually, when it comes to econometric publications on identification strategy. This means how can we find really reliable analysis which allows a causal interpretation, yes. And perhaps we're a little bit long already in time. I think it would be too much to explain it, but there are methods actually, like instrument variable estimation, difference approach, regression discontinuities, and so on. And when it comes to prognosis, there is more and more simulation in complex models and so on. However, I think in the future, first, the 2 things should be there. I think in terms of statistical literacy, the broader population, after knowing some numbers, I hope this will be the case, should become more and more close to the point to separate between coincidence and causality. Yes, and this easy question, is the one affecting the other, or the other the one, or both by a third? Everyone should ask him or herself this question. When it comes to prognosis and modeling, I think that at the moment, Nikki Popper and others are making big effort actually to connect many dots, lots of variables in complex models and so on. And I think in terms of this, the explanation why model is producing the output is not so clear anymore in all cases. In econometrics, we tried always to have a limited number of variables which are explaining one dependent variable. And in network analysis and so on, you're connecting now X variables, 20, 30, and so on and so on. And in this course, I think it will be a challenge for the future, even in science, to have multivariable models, and don't forget to be able to explain how the one dot is affecting the other and why.
Thank you. It's a complex question, I know.
Yeah, sorry.
So thank you very much, Professor Thomas. I think it's shortly past 10 o'clock. Thank you very much for your excellent keynote, and thank you for being our guest.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
It was an honor, and it really delights me how many participants joined us today again. Top speaker, top topic, top members. So thank you all for joining, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you next time. And I will close the session now.
Can I just ask one last question? It would be so fabulous if someone wants to stay 3 more minutes, because Professor, it was really fabulous listening to you. My name is Saskia Wallner, AmCham Publico. You could have talked for hours, we could have listened for hours. But since you are in Austria for 5 years now, since 2017, I've seen, and you've also published on media and the influence of media on decision making and so on, I was wondering whether you could maybe just give us your assessment on the Austrian, if you want, media and economy and politics connection, or how you experience this special situation here in Austria. I would really love to hear your thoughts on that, and your view on, since you live in Austria for 5 years now and have lived everywhere in the States and so on, in Germany, of course. What is special here? What would be your description of this Austrian special situation?
Well, thank you for this question. And actually now the session will go on till 12:30 or something like this. One of my academic research field is the impact of media on perception and decisions, which I do with econometric methods and the role of media in democracies. However, to be honest, I did lots of research on German media and US media, but not here on media in Austria in an empirical way. So I would not like to say just my impression, not based on numbers. I can say, of course, we have here a smaller media market in comparison to Germany, for instance. This is clear. I see some rather remarkable efforts to have some quality media here. However, some tries to establish additional ones were not successful. See the try of the Neue Zürcher Zeitung to establish here another thing, or other installed media. I would like to have a more closer look, and I still did not really understand how media are here financed. So this is interesting to compare with other countries as well. But at least one thing I can tell you, because I have the numbers, that was that I was part of a committee with the association which did install in the year 2013 in Germany, and then later in 2014 in Austria and Switzerland, an economist ranking in Neue Zürcher Zeitung, Die Presse in Austria, and Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Deutschland. And this is measuring not only the quotations in scientific journals, but the quotations in the media, as well as the being known among politicians in ministries. We wanted a little bit to give a ranking for economists which are not only in the ivory tower working, but transferring the knowledge to the broader public as well. And since this ranking is installed in all 3 countries, the quotations of scientific economists in the media did rise. They are still on a low level, actually. So Joe Public often does not perceive the statements by the scientists, and it could be improved even more. But the development, I think, goes perhaps at least in this perspective, in this dimension, in the right direction. But of course, space of improvement is always given.
Sorry for yeah.
But I'm very open to follow up with you in person, or of course the media question I could give in my next lecture at AmCham, perhaps in whatever time.
We'll invite you.
So, Professor Thomas, it was a pleasure. It was an honor to have you as a guest, really, and it was highly interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining, to all of you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. So now we have to close the session. Bye-bye and all the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.